Brothers and sisters, hold your breath, because something revolutionary is happening in southern Africa that has the West scrambling. We're witnessing the rise of a fearless leader who's not just breaking barriers, but shattering the very foundations of neo-colonial control. Her name is Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, and she's about to change everything. On March 21, 2025, history was made when 72-year-old Nandi-Ndaitwah was sworn in as Namibia's first female president. But this isn't just about gender equality. This is about a seasoned liberation fighter who's now wielding presidential power to forge a new African alliance that's sending shockwaves through Western capitals. Let's start with what's got everyone talking. Picture this. You're a Zambian trader wanting to do business in Namibia, or a Namibian student hoping to study in Zambia. For decades, you've needed expensive passports, lengthy bureaucratic processes, and documentation that many ordinary Africans simply couldn't afford. But that's about to change forever. In August 2025, Namibia and Zambia announced plans to allow their citizens to travel across their shared border using only national identity cards, completely eliminating the need for passports between these nations. This isn't just a policy tweak. It's a revolutionary assault on the colonial borders that have kept Africans separated for over a century. This builds on a successful model already in place between Namibia and Botswana since February 2023. Proving that when African leaders prioritize continental unity over Western approval, remarkable things happen. Now we're seeing the emergence of what could become Southern Africa's most powerful economic and political alliance. But here's what makes this so significant. These aren't just random policy decisions. They're calculated moves by a leader who understands that Africa's strength lies in unity, not in the artificial divisions imposed by colonial powers during the Berlin Conference of 1884. To understand why Nandi-Ndaitwah's presidency represents such a seismic shift, we need to understand her journey. This is a woman who joined the liberation struggle as a teenager in the 1960s, enduring decades of exile in Zambia, Tanzania, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. She's not some Western-educated elite who's disconnected from Africa's struggles. She is the struggle. Born in 1952, Nandi-Ndaitwah has held various high-level political and ministerial positions over an uninterrupted period of 57 years within SWAPO, the liberation movement that fought against apartheid South Africa's illegal occupation of Namibia. This woman has been fighting for African liberation longer than many of us have been alive. When she won the 2024 presidential election with 57% of the vote, it wasn't just a victory for women's representation. It was a mandate for transformation from a population ready for bold leadership. From day one, President Nandi-Ndaitwah has moved with the precision of someone who understands that African liberation requires urgent action. She immediately expanded women's representation by appointing Lucia Witbooi as vice president and Sarah Kugongelwa Amadila as Speaker of the National Assembly, making Namibia the first African country to have its top 3 government positions held by women. But it's her economic policies that have really caught Western attention. Under her leadership, Namibia has been implementing aggressive diversification policies, moving away from dependence on raw material exports toward value-added manufacturing and local beneficiation of natural resources. Think about this strategically. Namibia sits on some of the world's largest uranium deposits, has significant offshore oil and gas discoveries projected to produce hundreds of thousands of barrels per day by 2030, and shares borders with mineral-rich Zambia and diamond powerhouse Botswana. When you combine these resources with border-free movement and coordinated economic policies, you're looking at the potential for a Southern African economic powerhouse. Now, here's where things get really interesting for those of us who've been following the continental liberation movement. What Nandi-Ndaitwah is doing in Southern Africa mirrors exactly what we've seen in the Sahel with leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. The Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have shown us the blueprint. Reject Western military presence, reclaim control over natural resources, implement common visa policies, and prioritize regional integration over external dependency. Despite facing Western sanctions and destabilization attempts, these nations are thriving because they're putting African interests first. Nandi-Ndaitwah is applying this same formula in Southern Africa. The difference is that Southern Africa has traditionally been seen as more stable, which really meant more compliant with Western interests. But stability built on external dependency isn't stability at all. It's vulnerability. Let's talk numbers and strategic importance. Namibia's uranium reserves are among the world's largest, and with global demand for clean energy increasing, this positions the country as a critical player in the energy transition. Add to this the offshore oil and gas discoveries, and you're looking at serious revenue potential. But here's the key insight. When you combine Namibia's energy resources with Zambia's copper, essential for renewable energy infrastructure, and Botswana's diamonds, plus the elimination of border barriers between these nations, you create conditions for unprecedented economic integration. The Western-dominated global trade system has always relied on keeping African nations fragmented, competing against each other for Western markets, and exporting raw materials at low prices while importing finished goods at high prices. But when African nations start trading freely with each other, processing their own resources, and coordinating their economic policies, that entire system starts to crumble. Now, for those of us who've been studying African liberation movements, we know the West has a playbook when African leaders start asserting genuine independence. First comes the diplomatic pressure, concerns about democratic governance, calls for responsible leadership, warnings about regional instability. If that doesn't work, we see economic pressure, sanctions, market manipulation, withdrawal of aid with conditions. Look at what happened to the Sahel states when they expelled French military forces and reclaimed control over their gold and uranium resources. Then, if all else fails, we've seen more sinister methods, the kind that ended with leaders like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and others who dared to put African interests first. Nandi-Ndaitwah must be acutely aware of these dangers. But here's what gives her an advantage. She's building alliances. The partnership with Zambia and Botswana creates mutual defense mechanisms. When you're part of a regional bloc, you're much harder to isolate or destabilize than when you're standing alone. We can't ignore the significance of having a female leader driving this transformation. African women have always been at the forefront of liberation struggles, but they've often been marginalized in post-independence leadership. Nandi-Ndaitwah represents something powerful, the intersection of gender equality and anti-imperialism. Her focus on youth employment, education, and economic empowerment reflects an understanding that true liberation must include all segments of society. When you have young people with education and economic opportunities, they become stakeholders in their country's independence rather than potential sources of instability that external forces can exploit. What we're seeing with the Namibia-Zambia-Botswana alliance represents the practical implementation of Pan-African ideals. For decades, we've talked about African unity in conferences and summits. But here we have leaders actually dismantling the barriers that keep Africans separated. The Casa Visa Agreement between Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe shows this is part of a broader regional integration strategy. When you can travel freely, trade freely, and share resources freely within a region, you create the conditions for genuine economic development. Compare this to what the European Union did, created a common market, common currency, and free movement of people. But Europe did this while simultaneously maintaining exploitative relationships with Africa. Now Africa is saying, we'll create our own integration, for our own benefit. One aspect that's often overlooked in these discussions is the role of technology and infrastructure in supporting regional integration. The border ID card system requires sophisticated verification technologies, shared databases, and coordinated security protocols between nations. This technical integration creates the foundation for deeper economic cooperation. When your banking systems can communicate, when your telecommunications networks are integrated, when your transportation infrastructure connects seamlessly, that's when you start seeing real economic transformation. Nandi-Ndaitwah understands that 21st century sovereignty requires technological independence. African nations that remain dependent on Western technology for critical infrastructure remain vulnerable to external control, regardless of their political rhetoric. Let's talk about the most critical element of any liberation strategy: preparing the next generation. Under Nandi-Ndaitwah's leadership, Namibia has committed to significant investments in education and youth employment programs. This is strategic thinking at its finest. When young Africans are educated, employed, and connected to their continental neighbors through easy travel and trade opportunities, they become the foundation for sustained independence. They're not desperately seeking opportunities in the West. They're building opportunities at home. Now, let's be realistic about the challenges. Economic transformation doesn't happen overnight, and there will be internal and external pressures. Corruption remains a challenge in many African institutions, and there are always local elites who profit from the current system and will resist change. External pressure is guaranteed. The West has too many economic interests in maintaining the current extractive relationship with Africa to simply accept this transformation peacefully. We should expect increased diplomatic pressure, potential economic sanctions, and attempts to destabilize regional cooperation. But here's the crucial difference between now and previous liberation movements. The global balance of power has shifted. China, Russia, and other nations offer alternative partnerships that don't come with the same neo-colonial conditions as Western relationships. This gives African leaders more options and reduces their vulnerability to Western pressure. What happens in Namibia doesn't stay in Namibia. Successful models of African integration and resource control inspire other regions. We're already seeing increased cooperation between West African nations, East African integration initiatives, and now this Southern African alliance. If the Namibia-Zambia-Botswana model proves successful, reducing poverty, increasing trade, creating jobs, and maintaining sovereignty, other African nations will take notice. Success is contagious, just like failure used to be contagious when African nations were following failed Western-imposed structural adjustment programs. Here's why this story matters beyond Africa. The global economy has been built on African resources flowing cheaply to Western markets. When African nations start controlling their resources, processing them locally, and trading freely with each other, it disrupts global supply chains and pricing structures that have enriched the West for centuries. This isn't just about fairness or justice, though those matter enormously. It's about the emergence of new centers of global economic power. A united, resource-controlling, economically integrated Africa changes everything. Commodity prices, manufacturing locations, trade routes, currency relationships, everything. The West's panic isn't just about losing influence in Africa. It's about the potential collapse of economic structures that have defined global capitalism for centuries. So what should we expect next? If this alliance deepens and expands, we should anticipate. First, attempts to bring in additional nations. Angola and Zimbabwe are logical next partners given their geographic positions and resource endowments. South Africa, despite its complex relationship with both Western interests and African liberation, will face increasing pressure to choose sides. Second, deeper economic integration beyond just border controls. Shared currency arrangements, coordinated resource development policies, joint infrastructure projects, these are the logical next steps. Third, increased Western pressure and potential destabilization attempts. The more successful this model becomes, the more desperate the efforts to undermine it will become. Brothers and sisters, what we're witnessing with President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah's leadership is nothing short of historic. This 72-year-old liberation veteran is implementing the Pan-African vision that previous generations could only dream about. The border integration with Zambia, the resource control policies, the focus on youth and education, the regional alliance building. These aren't just policy initiatives. They're the building blocks of genuine African independence. But transformation requires more than just good leadership. It requires sustained popular support, continental solidarity, and vigilance against destabilization attempts. Those of us in the African diaspora and throughout the continent who support genuine liberation need to stay informed, engaged, and ready to defend these gains. If you found this analysis helpful, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to understand what's really happening in Africa. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is just beginning, and there will be major developments to cover in the coming months. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand the real dynamics of African politics beyond the superficial coverage in mainstream media. And most importantly, let us know in the comments what you think about President Nandi-Ndaitwah's leadership and the emerging Southern African alliance. Are we witnessing the beginning of a genuine African renaissance? Can this model of regional integration and resource control succeed against Western opposition? What lessons does this hold for other African regions? The lioness of Southern Africa has roared, and her voice is echoing across the continent. The question now is whether we'll support this vision of African unity and independence, or allow external forces to divide and undermine us once again. The choice, as always, is ours, but the window of opportunity won't remain open forever. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep fighting for African liberation.